Okay, well, good morning, and thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to give a very short speech. I've sat through enough of them that are very long, and I think after about 10 minutes, people switch off in my experience. So it'll be quite short, and the value of these sessions are in the Q&A, so I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A if there are any questions. So the speech is largely going to be drawing on my experience of delivering complex projects, programs, largely on operational sites. I've not spent a lot of my career delivering greenfield. It's mostly been brownfield, i.e. existing facilities. So I'm going to split my talk into three. I'm going to talk about kind of, for my sector, rail, but it's very applicable to most infrastructure, why we do these upgrades and some of the problems. I'm then going to talk about the lessons learned that I think are applicable to a wide range of sectors. And I'm going to look ahead a little bit and think about the important themes that I think the community, the profession of project management and project controls will have to face, and the tools that we'll need to deliver them. So if I can start a bit about my sector, rail. How many of you are from the rail sector, just so I can get a sense? Yeah, fair smattering. Yeah. By the way, I thought it was very cruel to put me in a bar to make this speech. It's quite disconcerting. So the thing about railways is numbers have doubled. Roughly since privatisation around the mid-90s, the numbers of people using the rail system have doubled. And that's a massive issue when you've got a system that's been underinvested for a very long time. Obviously, recently it's had huge investment. I'm talking about since the war. Rail was seen as actually a declining asset. And you've got some Victorian structures. I think on the national rail system, there's something like 30,000 bridges, of which the average age is 121 years, something like that, just to give you a measure. This is a very, very old system, creaking at the seams, in huge need of modernisation. So that's the challenge. And if you look at it, you've got some very, very complex assets, safety critical assets, and you've got huge numbers of people using them. So the challenge is to renew the assets, increase capacity and performance. That's the trick. You can play it. And we're increasingly deploying modern technology, digital technology. That's my role on very busy operational lines and stations. So you can imagine that's a huge challenge. I guess it's a challenge that's shared from what I can see in defence, nuclear, oil and gas, petrochem. We all have the same challenges. Some lessons learned. I guess the first one, and again this goes for a lot of sectors, safety is always the first priority. So everything we do has to be around how you keep the system safe, how you keep the integrity of the system safe. And when you're upgrading something that's operational, I mean, there are lots of phrases that have been thrown around, like doing open heart surgery on a person who's playing tennis, etc., etc. But it is true. You're taking something apart. And certainly my experience at LU, where I've recently left and joined National Rail, we were taking apart assets and putting them back to service in about 4 hours every night. And you used to think about that risk all the time. So the controls you need in place, bringing it back to the whole project controls thing, the controls you need in place when you're doing such intrusive work on assets that are being used by millions of people every day, as you can imagine, are quite stringent. So that's the first thing. And you need to understand that, because in the way you design your contracts, the way you design your projects, that becomes quite an important issue in the planning. And if you don't think about that up front, guess what? The costs and the programs start running out of control. Okay, stage works generally define the end works. What I mean by stage works, if you have an end goal, you define it into a number of stages, and each of those stages, the design work, the safety case might be as much as the final stage. The more stages you have, the greater the cost. You've got to think very carefully about how you chunk up your project. The other, obviously, big issue is understanding underlying asset risk. If you don't understand what's out there, then it's very, very hard to design and make sure you can scope and put boundaries around what you're doing in terms of both cost and time. Okay, so understanding the asset condition, and the number of times I see projects going out there where the biggest issue is, well, we didn't really understand we had to fringe to this, we didn't understand the power supply that we were connecting to wasn't right, the comms network wasn't up to it, the structure wasn't right. And you think, how did you get this far? How did you get through those gateways when you didn't understand asset conditions? So understanding asset condition, and it may well be that the organisation you're working in doesn't have a complete asset register. That's fine, and is actually quite normal, okay, because a lot of these old infrastructure projects, you don't necessarily have that detailed understanding. What you need to do then is to put in place, in the initial stage of the project, that detailed survey and understanding of the asset condition. Okay. The other thing is closure constraints. What do I mean by that? If you've got an operational asset, how many outages can I have? How often can I take it away from the users? And increasingly, I have found in my sector that the number of times you can close the railway is becoming less and less and less. And it's becoming as critical a resource as cash, okay? Because it becomes the driver for how you design, how you implement, and how you commission. And if you can't shut the system down, that becomes a huge constraint on time and cost. So again, understanding right up front what your closure constraints are is very important. Clarity of requirements, this applies, of course, to all projects, but again, it's from my quite long experience now, amazing how often I'm seeing projects where, as we speak, as it's being commissioned, the requirements are still being honed down. That's incredibly difficult on some of these programs where you're basically working on legacy assets with users perhaps used to using old technology. But nevertheless, it requires a huge effort, but it's an effort that's required to reach out to the users of the systems and to understand how they're going to actually bring these things into use. And if you don't do that, what you'll face is, as you bring these projects on, right at the end when it's going to be the most expensive time to change, people are saying, oh, I didn't want it to work that way. I wanted those things to be blue. I wanted that thing to be over there. Too late. And it's a theme I see time and time again. I've talked about changing technology, but often we're bringing on systems that are fundamentally different to the way people have worked before. So you need to think about how you engage the people. People change, business change becomes a very important factor to manage. I talk later on in this about how do you control stuff that's not tangible, what I call the creative side of the business, whether it's software, design, people change, business change. These are some of the hardest things to control, yet increasingly in our very complex program environment, they become as important and as fundamental as what I call the hard deliverables, the core infrastructure. Talked about the early and full involvement of the operator and the maintainer. If people are going to be maintaining stuff that is different, you've got to think in the project, how am I going to train them? What training manuals do they need? Yet again, I have to say, time and time again, I'm seeing projects at the end where we're still not fully engaging with the maintainer. Guess what? They come along, they want it done differently. They're not ready. Project has to carry on maintaining for a longer time. Your schedule, your cost goes over. Recognizing application risk. So often you hear that it's proven elsewhere, whatever it is, whatever clever thing you're deploying. It's proven elsewhere. It works in Oslo. It works in Vancouver. It may work over there, but you've got to recognize application risk, which is you're applying that technology or that product to a local environment. You need to understand what the delta is, either difference between how it works elsewhere and what it's going to be here. People call it application risk, but I've seen that application risk drive fundamental change in a product. And again, if you've assumed a very low application risk because people have told you it works elsewhere, you haven't factored that into the plans, guess what? Cost and time go over. I've talked about managing design and software, the creative things. It's really difficult to manage stuff where people have to think and there's no clear plan at the beginning. So what you have to do then is clearly overdo the breaking down the milestones and think very hard about how people understand and work that design process and actually embed yourself often in the design teams. It's the only way to retain control. I think the other issue is there are some programs that are so complex that they go off the scale. And these are these large mega programs that we often read about where they become out of control or seemingly out of control. And I've been involved in one or two of them. So the first trick is to recognize when you are in such a program. They're usually characterized by some of the things I've written down here. Usually involve a lot of development, usually involve global supply chain, usually on a very complex operational environment, maybe often a unionized environment, maybe with a lot of political pressure. You'll recognize it if you're on it, and it has massive scale. Often those programs defy traditional management. So what you have to do is, first of all, recognize when you're in that environment, not too late and blimey, 3 years in, guess what? It's out of control. But then apply special techniques like breaking it down, having lots and lots of sub-projects. And when there's a lot of risk, having development stages and recognizing development stages and being strong enough to say, no, I'm not going to take that thing forward. Finally, I guess in all the things I've done, the most important thing is the right people. You can never overcome the fact that ultimately good people, brilliant people will make the most complex, difficult, impossible projects happen. So investing in the right people and the right expertise is vital. I worked with a guy many years ago who said you could recognize a brilliant executive by the person who surrounds himself with world-class people. Always surround yourself with the best. Is your best risk management. Money is a very important factor. Increasingly, we're all being driven to bottom lines, the very, very unforgiving environment on cost overruns. You go in the press, you're lambasted by everybody, quite justifiably, because people feel sore. They've put a certain amount of money aside, and it's gone over. So they've got to go and now try and get money from elsewhere and stop other things. That's never a nice thing to do. So we have to recognise in our community that getting things done to cost, but in a value for money way, is the fundamental requirement. So some, again, tricks of the trade I've learned over time. Benchmarking is very important, but it has its limitations. What is benchmarking? Benchmarking is comparing what you're doing with others around the world who are doing similar things. And it's both approach and cost. Sometimes the cost is just not comparable. Because say if you say London is one of the highest living costs in the world. So you can't compare the cost of doing a project in London with the cost of doing a project in somewhere where the cost of living is much cheaper. What you can, though, learn is how people approach it. So benchmarking is useful. A lot of people use benchmarking slavishly, which is a mistake. You've got to recognise to compare apples with apples, not apples with tractors. But benchmarking is a very useful tool. So try and break down what you're doing. I used to work in a project where I expected all my team, and I was doing an entire capital programme, to understand the cost of an escalator, the unit cost, the cost of a lift, the cost of a kilometre of track, the cost of a unit of signalling, the cost of a square metre of a station, and be able to know their costs and compare them with the best in the UK and London and around the world, and to be able to explain them. And eventually became quite a good way of driving performance. I think measuring capability as an organisation and as an individual is very important. This links back to my theme about surrounding yourself with the very best. I've worked in organisations where they're very shy of measuring their capability. I think it's a very good thing, but again, it shouldn't be used slavishly. I've worked on projects that have the highest P3M3 rating, but I wouldn't recommend them. Okay, so again, just use it appropriately, but it is a good thing to do to measure your growth on a maturity or a capability curve. I am a big fan of independent assurance. I think with the best in the world, all of us can get too cozy in what we're doing. And I think you do need that independent challenge. So bringing in third-party people, independent reviewers, having a truly independent and challenging means of assurance, I think is fundamental. And I think if you impose it on yourselves, it will stop others imposing it on you. But I think it's a key requirement and keeps us honest. Clearly avoid rework. The further down the life cycle you go, rework becomes more and more expensive. It's so rare, it is so rare these days to see projects or programs where things are right first time. If only we could get things right first time, we'd save a lot of time and money. Usually I see the 4th, 5th, 6th, 12th iteration of a design. It's so time consuming. And it's worth putting in a bit of extra effort up front to make sure you get it right first time. Right first time should be a mantra in everything we do. Design for whole of life. What I mean about that, don't just design for the capital cost. Think about how you're going to maintain something. Who's going to take it on? What is its whole life cost? What are its obligations on the people you're handing it over to? And certainly in my sector, the whole life cost, the maintenance and operation over 40 years couldn't dwarf the capital cost. So you've got to think about the whole life cycle. And that requires a different relationship with your supply chain. You want to incentivize your supply chain to be with you along the way, not just to give you something at capital cost and leave you holding the baby. So that's a very important factor. Involve contractors early. I've always found the supply chain have most of the answers. And I'm not a fan of the traditional kind of master-servant relationship, client-contractor. It doesn't work. It's unreconstructed. And it has changed, and it needs to change even more. The supply chain, increasingly with much more complex products, own the answers. And clients have to work in a different way with the supply chain and certainly involve them early in the auctioneering, the early design. Learn from them. They're a massive resource. They've seen it time and time again. They are very frustrated when they come late to the party, are giving a specification, they say, I would never have done it that way. But again, it's too late at that point. I think creating opportunities for third-party financing and funding increasingly are a way of sourcing the funding for projects, and certainly if you're in a public sector environment, getting relief from going to the government all the time to say, we need to finance this, is very important. So the ability to attract third-party funding, to think creatively about your project, how you can create benefits, how you can make those benefits off balance sheet and attract third-party financing and funding become increasingly important. Interfaces. One of my favourite phrases, the interfaces always get you in the end. You've got to spend a lot of time, coming back again to project controls, clarifying the interfaces, because the interfaces are where costs and time run away, and they obviously go between contracts, subcontracts, projects. So in project controls, to me, one of the key roles of the project manager is to understand and manage the interfaces. The vertical silos tend to look after themselves. You can chunk them and give them to somebody. You as a project manager are responsible and accountable for all the interfaces. Manage risk at the appropriate level. I have seen so many risk registers that have 5,000 entries. Totally meaningless and useless. I'm never going to read them. They may be useful for some people, but at the senior level, what people are interested in is, what are my top 5 risks? And how are they being managed? I will never read a 500 activity risk register. You know, it's like somebody said, sorry I sent you a long postcard, I didn't have time to write you a short one. Always spend the time and the effort to summarize what are the key risks and give line of sight to the senior managers on a job of those risks. I'm a big fan of output specifications. I think we have a very clever, innovative supply chain, and I think they're often stifled by input detailed specifications. So it's worth just understanding what they call in defense sector, the cardinal points. What are the things that really matter to you? Capability, capacity, performance, cost, output, reliability. Spend some time setting those out and allow the supply chain to innovate around those. The greater innovation you can give, the greater room you can give for innovation, the better the product you'll get. And finally, managing to outturn costs, not tender costs. Time and time again, I've seen people go, yeah, I've got them in for well under the budget. Then you come back to the end of the job, it's exceeded the budget by 40%. The real prize is, what is the outturn cost? And understanding what that is likely to be and incentivizing your supply chain and your partners to work with you to that outturn cost is the real management prize. Tender costs are illusory because they are typically 30 to 40% underneath the outturn cost. One of the tools I used, again, when I was on the underground, was expanding the traditional time cost quality graph to show some things like this. Okay, I think this is all going to be on the app, so I'm not going to read it, but we put safety as number 1 because we felt explicitly we had to say that. And safety is many faceted. It's not just construction safety, it's system safety, design safety, integrity, and then again for the controls environment, my challenge always was, give me some metrics on how I measure safety. How do I measure leading indicators? Lagging indicators are too late. Stuff has happened. What are the leading indicators? So one of the things, for example, on design was how many errors were found in checking. That's a really good indicator of how well design is being managed. We talked about whole life performance, including reliability, availability, output. We talked about closures. Closures were incredibly important to us. We had lots of metrics around, do we go for different types of closures? Do we have extended nights? Do we have weekends? Do we have late startups on Sunday? We incentivized the supply chain around minimizing closures. But again, if you have that as a core requirement, it fundamentally affects the design of how things are done, and again, encourages innovation. And we talked about financial performance, not just hitting the budget. Again, if you work in a complex organization that is funded through lots of different means, things like forecast accuracy are really important. If you say you're going to spend £300 million in that year, what they'll have to do as an organization is allocate that 300 to you. If you do not spend it, it makes it really difficult the next year to go and argue for another tranche. So things like forecast accuracy become incredibly important. Just summarizing what I think the importance of project controls are to people like me, it's the radar screen. You're flying the plane. The only thing you know is what your instrument panel is telling you. You don't know what's going on back there. You are not that connected to the front line because the front line is all over the place. It's everywhere. It's distributed. You may have 3,000 or 4,000 people working for you. So you look to project controls to be your connection and your understanding of what are the key parameters, what are the key performance indicators you need to see. And it's something that needs a lot of design. There is no one solution. For any one project, you need to spend a lot of time thinking about what are the key measures you need to be giving upwards to the people flying the plane. They'll be very unforgiving if things go wrong and there were no leading indicators. If the plane has to make an emergency landing, you want to know ahead of time. You don't want to crash. So think about that very much. And I think the other thing is you need, certainly in the organisation I'm leading at the moment, you need a PMO that is representative of the complexity and scale of what you're managing. I call my PMOs my air traffic control. There are just so many things going on, all with interfaces, that you need some means of connecting those up, but pulling in the entire industry. So that is a very important factor for me. And again, time and time again, I've seen on contracts this not really understood, so that what you get is an argument way down the line what the contract program was it accepted, the importance of having baseline contracts, programs, schedules signed up to is fundamental. So I'm going to come to the end because I do want to have some time for Q&A. I think looking ahead, I can see 4 important themes. I think increasingly the demand on the profession of project management, program controls, especially in the infrastructure space, is assured delivery. People are sick and tired of projects that keep going over budget and running late. And if you compare us to other industries, they find it much easier to deliver projects to a defined cost and budget. Not all the time. There are well-known examples of that not being the case. But, you know, the challenge is, why can't we do that? And I think what funders want to see is as close to as possible 100% certainty that the things we say we're going to do actually are done. And I think that's a trend that's going to become more and more important. So how do we as a profession get to that, what I call 100% or as close to as possible, assured delivery of projects? And I think there are 3 things at least that are going to make that happen. Increasingly in the program complexity of things we're doing, collaboration is vital. The days of just one person controlling all the levers are way, way past. We work in very complex environments with multiple stakeholders, often multiple parties responsible or having a big input to the program and the delivery. Collaboration is so important. So collaborative skills, collaboration hubs, means of people coming together, aligning of incentives, very, very important. And that leads to the roles of leadership, behavior, understanding of organizations becoming much more important than they have maybe in the past. Digital technology. Things are changing so, so fast. Yeah? The product life cycle of stuff we're putting in now is 4 or 5 years. So how do we respond to that as a profession? Automation, digitization, BIM. What is our role going to be in 20 years' time? I think we need to get on top of that and harness it and use it to our advantage. And finally, people, and I'm going to finish with my last slide. I think it'll explode. But it's all about the people. It's always all about the people. So it's really exciting to see so many young entrants coming into the profession of project management. It's never been in a more exciting place, you know, with chartership round the corner. I think the profession of project controls especially, to me, is fundamental to that. You are the glue that puts this all together. But if you just look at some of the things going on, it's just an incredibly exciting time. So I think we need to work very hard at attracting the right people in, making sure we've got the right capability. But remember what I said, the best way of delivering projects is having the best people. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'm now happy to take any questions. Just stick your hand up and Rojan will wander around with the microphone. Mark, then Simon. Yep.
Hello. People is a key issue, I think, moving forward with Heathrow and Hinkley, HS2. There's some big projects coming up, and the skills gap's going to be an issue, particularly at the top end. How do you plan to address that within your business?
It's a very good point, and I think we are reaping the results of very poor investment in people in the past. I mean, the infrastructure space has only recently started to come back, and we've had decades of underinvestment in training, recruitment. A lot of the big companies, certainly in the late 90s, the recession then, and in the 80s, turned off recruitment. So what you're seeing is a dearth of talent. So you've got to start at the bottom and bring people in, the younger entrants. But I think at the top, we need to be very clear that we will take people with relevant experience. I think I see too many sectors who are very precious. You've got to be a rail person or an aerospace person. I think a lot of these skills are transferable. I think there are a lot of skills from around the world in other sectors that people can look at in a much more open way. I think there are good people around there. We've just got to be a bit more open-minded and not forgetting about what I said, where this is all about collaboration, digital technology, and stakeholder management as much as your technical understanding of the space you're in. We're not in a good place, if I'm honest. None of us are. Simon was going to say something. Then there's somebody over there.
Yeah, hi David. I'd be interested to hear your views on the role of the sponsor in projects. Obviously there's the custodian is a business case. A lot of these changes go for it, and where you've seen good examples and potentially bad examples of sponsorship in projects.
Thanks. Another very good question. Well, sponsorship is fundamental because if you think about some of the stuff, requirements, you've got to have clear requirements. And the best sponsors I've seen see their fundamental role as driving the clarity of those requirements across the different users, the operators, the maintainers, the customers. You know, the worst ones I've seen just hide, and then when it comes too late, they sort of say it's all the project's fault. Well, it kind of is. It's always the project manager's fault, but it's a bit too late to be having that discussion. So to me, sponsors are fundamental, but I see their core role as two. One is getting the requirements sorted, but somebody's got to be the custodian of the benefits realization. And the project is no use unless it delivers the benefits. It could be a brilliant bit of technology, a brilliant bit of construction, but it doesn't matter if it doesn't deliver the benefit. So always think about what's the end case, and the sponsor should be the custodian. Because, you know, if you're in a project, you're just busy delivering it. It's just as it becomes all consuming. So those are good marks of sponsorship to me. I think there's a question over there. I have to wait for the mic to come back. And then we'll come to you, sir. Over there. Can you stick your hand up, then Rojan can find you. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Andrew Rooker. Currently, there is 2 lines on a map for HS3 or 2 going to the northern powerhouses. We're talking stakeholder buying and environmental agendas. But the bigger picture then will be what can be created in the northern powerhouses and use the end product of HS2 going north. What I'm trying to say is, how do we buy in with the stakeholders and locally?
It's a really important point. I think for too long, excuse me, there's been a perception that infrastructure is very much based in London and the South East, and let's be honest, it has benefited London hugely. And there is now a clear move, rightly, to say infrastructure is much broader than London. That's why HS2 is seen as very important as joining up cities. And if I go back to the rail story, we're seeing that the biggest issue is connection between cities to make sure people can travel between. The Northern Powerhouse is a brilliant example of how we're going to create a parallel sort of centre to London in the north, and I think the investment will increasingly flow there. It's important in everything we do that we recognise we've got to join up and connect cities together, because that's how you get prosperity. So, I mean, I personally spent some time up with the Northern Powerhouse, the TFN, Transport for the North. I think I've got a couple of meetings soon, but I think they're seen as an increasingly powerful force. And you can see with the HS2, it's not just about London, it's how you get Birmingham to Leeds to Manchester. So it's...
Of the 1980s of the steel infrastructures around that area, where it's gone to a service provider, so there's got to be a bigger plan for manufacturing to return.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's a very good point. I think there's somebody over here. Bear with us, we only seem to have one roving mic.
Hi, it's Rob Whiting from Faithful and Gould. One of the other key aspects, I'm not sure if it was on your list, but I'd be interested in your view, is around when you need to change the culture of management to be friendly or receptive to project controls. So what I mean by that is traditionally, like you say, people don't like overspend, they don't like late projects, and if you've got an aggressive attitude, people are reticent to either tell you things are going to go variant to what you're planning, or they just delay in telling you. So getting companies and senior and middle managers to change their attitude so that they're open to what's perceived as bad news is really important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And to go back to my analogy, you're flying the plane. Who wouldn't want to know your engine's on fire or you're running out of fuel? I mean, you've got to be a dumb pilot if you don't want to know that. So if I just stretch that analogy to our business, if you're in charge of a project or a program, you absolutely want to know what's going on. And your project controls team or manager or leader are your fundamental tool. I mean, to me, they're at my right hand all the time because they're my link. And I want a strong one because I know that stuff happens. Stuff is going on back there. And everybody tells me it's all perfect. I never believe them. I know there's all kinds of skullduggery and stuff. I was going to say lies then, but not. So you want a proper team with a bit of teeth and a bit of tension at the centre to be able to go to the sniff it out. So I think you're a very poor leader if you don't want your project controls people to tell you the truth. But the key thing you won't be forgiven for is telling it when it's too late. That's when I'll be hard on you. Because there's no use then, is it? So it's about understanding the leading indicators and telling me if I'm going to be overspending, if there's a bad news. You know, one of the things I expect my project controls team to do is sniff around the industry. If there's chatter, you know, this project's going late, there's lots of people leaving, we hear it's in disarray. I want to be the first to hear that chatter, not the last. Yeah? So you need a project controls team who are close to what's going on. Don't want to read it in the press. Two more over here, I think. A lady and a gentleman, or gentleman and a lady, whoever you get to first. And we'll come to you afterwards. Thanks.
Hi. How do we change the culture around cost? You talked about the importance of managing to outturns, but how do we change the culture that says if you talk realistically about what your costs are, you won't get the funding, but then when you put in a tender price to get the business, everybody knows that's wrong, and so you start getting the feedback loop of people automatically doubling tender costs and then saying we can't do this, like HS2. We can't do this because even though they're saying it will cost 20 billion, it will actually cost 50 or whatever. How do we break that cycle?
It's a really, really important point, and there's no easy answer to it, except experience, which is that if you just go with tender costs, the experience is that you're 30 to 40% under, unless you've really done a superb procurement exercise. So I think it's about maturity again and experience. Experienced leaders will know that tender costs are illusory, especially if they're beaten down to get a tight budget. And the general, if it's too good to be true, it is not true. It's generally the experience. So I think it's about experience and honesty. And again, just tell the truth. Don't allow yourselves to be browbeaten into saying, you know, it's going to be working. If you as the project controls, project manager, actually believe your tender costs are not the right cost, you've got to demand the right level of contingency risk. But also you spend it all in claims and negativity. I'd much rather have that money spent in getting the right outcome. But it's a curve we're on. It's a curve we're on. And this lady here had a question. Everybody's leaving, so I guess we must be running out of time. And there's one over here as well.
I'll try and make it quick. My question was following on from what you said on the dashboard and what information you want to know from the teams. And it's more, how do you avoid the disconnect between what milestones you're asking to be reported on in connection to what's actually happening on site, in terms of avoiding, you know, just meeting a milestone versus actually getting work done on site, because there can be quite a disconnect on there, and what do you do in that case?
That's a very good question, you're right. So it's all about, you know, just having, if you're on schedule performance, just having milestones is not good enough. You know, how much effort has been expended, how much cash has been spent, what's your value of work done? Yeah, so I think there's an array of measures apart just from milestones. To me, a milestone is the final, you know, I've delivered it, but there's a load of stuff that you need to balance to make sure that progress is as reported. You know, and that's again where I think a strong project controls team will be able to sniff around and tell you, you know, go and see it, measure it. And the hardest things are design and software. That's really difficult to get earn value on. That's when you need to spend a lot of time and effort breaking it down. And I would never be remote from bitter experience again from my core software provider or my core designer. Have a project manager or project controls in there. The best companies in that area, by the way, offer you a project control service. They will put our own people in. But don't just allow the creatives, who are fantastic, by the way, to just run it, because you'll get... There was a question over here. I think we have to finish because everybody's leaving.
Well done, Paul Nelson, Talis. So you mentioned earlier about rework and the cost of rework. I wonder how much you think that rework and I suppose distinguishing that from iterative design, and how much of that is driven by a need to be seen to be doing something rather than actually getting something right before going to the field?
I think there's an element of that, if I'm honest. And I think, again, it comes to how you buy this stuff and how you manage it. But you're right, some of it is not really rework, it's people actually iterating their design. And you've got to be, again, smart enough to know the difference. But certainly real rework is something to avoid. Okay, I think I better call it. Thanks for those of you left. Thanks for listening. And if there are any other questions, I'll be hanging around for a little bit. Thanks. Bye.